Before I start, I wanted to do some housekeeping work for a chat that I was involved in. If you go and Google my ancestor, you see him with huge handlebar mustaches. And for those of us who have facial hair, there was quite a lot of back and forth on a WhatsApp chat group about facial hair in general. And I thought I would put our evening in perspective by sharing with you that in 16th and 17th century Poland, Ukraine, the mustache was sacred. As was for the Cossacks what's called the choop, which is that tail that you have on your head and the rest is shaved. And those two elements were the definition of masculinity in 17th, 16th century Poland and Ukraine. And in fact, to such an extent that when Bogdan Khmelnytsky won a battle against the Polish nobles, he demanded that they shave or cut off their mustaches and deliver those mustaches to him as a symbol of his victory. So I thought I would just sort of close that conversation on that chat with that statement that for those of us who carry that facial hair necessity, we're doing it in honor of that 16th, 17th century sacred element. The second thing that I wanted to do to start this evening was to say that I feel very bad for you all, because I was invited to talk about Mazeppa tonight, but within the context of talking about myself, my family, and Russian history. And for those of you who know me well enough, that could well go into 1, 2 a.m. So if you were hoping to talk to your neighbors this evening, that's not going to happen. And there will be a quiz at the end of the evening. And based on that, you will either be paying for this dinner or you won't be. But the structure of the talk that I wanted to do is really share with you a little bit the personal journey. In a way, it's to familiarize you with some of the elements of the Mazeppa story, but from a personal standpoint. I did obviously want to talk a little bit about the Kotchoubey family because they feature quite prominently in the opera, they feature very prominently in the general story, and then of course put it into context from a historical standpoint. And Andre, thank you for sharing with us your family's journey, because obviously that's a small but important element to that overall Russian history that encompasses this whole journey that we're going to be on tonight. So those are the three things that I wanted to talk about. And I'm going to start with my personal journey by sharing with you that it's very difficult to be a father and a husband. Our family chat is called Oscars. And it's called Oscars because I was involved in a movie television project on Mazeppa, and my kids thought that was so funny because they figured I would never get anywhere with that project, but just for the sake of it, let's call Papa the head of the Oscars family in the case that he does win a major award. And it's an interesting journey because it came on the heels of a film called Bitter Harvest, which was produced in Canada. It talked really about the famine era in 1920, 1930 Ukraine. And the Mazeppa story is very much one of the first seminal stories about Ukraine. And for those of us who have grown up in the world of Russian culture, it not only informs poetry, it informs art, informs music. And so for us today, looking forward to June and July when Grange Park Opera will put on this opera, we are joining a history of people who have looked at this play, at this poem, at this opera in a very important lens when it comes to understanding politics, when it comes to understanding a region which today, of course, takes a lot of place on our front pages. But my journey with Mazeppa really began when I got a call from the director of Bitter Harvest to work on a movie version of Mazeppa. It turned out that actually doing costume dramas is a much more interesting format when you're talking about television series as opposed to movies. You're putting in quite a lot of effort in terms of costume, in terms of location, and you tend to make a lot more money in terms of leveraging that input cost across eight episodes as opposed to one movie. But at the time, it was very clear on a number of different fronts that we would have challenges. And one of the big challenges was the whole issue of a 65-year-old man falling in love with a 16-year-old woman or young lady. And the environment in which this movie was being discussed was clearly not going to be very positive, neither for my ambition to win an Oscar, nor for my reputation in general. So we had to tackle that whole element. In fact, from a historical standpoint, we know it took place, and there are a number of different ways that we know that. But obviously, from a modern-day audience standpoint, that it's not exactly the kind of story that you take your wife or your girlfriend to for a lovely date evening. The second challenge that we faced was obviously costs with respect to the idea of putting on battles and having lots of military scenes. There are ways to do that. Hungary is one of those destinations, but in general, it's a big challenge and a big cost to put that on. But ultimately, the big problem was, how do you develop the narrative and the story? And I thought that was very interesting, because when the libretto for Mazeppa the Opera was written, the libretto by Barunin was probably revised 20 times, and even at the end, Tchaikovsky was not very happy with the libretto, and so it was a real sort of effort to try to transform the inputs, which in fact were historical as well as artistic, and come up with something that works. And we ended up having exactly the same problem with the television series. And that's a way for me to at least introduce the fact that I did spend a little bit of time understanding the story, the challenges of creating this narrative. And so that was part of my sort of baptism into the Mazeppa world. The second thing I wanted to do before we start talking about the three elements that I want to bring together is really to ask you to pay attention to some of the ideas that are being shared within the context of today's war. Because there are a number of things that are going to emerge in this story, hopefully if I remember to incorporate all of that, so I'm going to leave the punchline with you right now. But Ukraine has always been this sort of frontier land, a land that has been fought over for centuries. I was talking with the former deputy foreign minister who was involved in the negotiations with Russia in 2022, and he's involved again today. And he said, you know, the incredible capacity for Ukraine to survive today is that in the mind of the Ukrainians, they're a nation, but they've never really forged a country, and they've never really had to forge a country because the boundaries were always shifting. The people that you meet in Donetsk are going to be completely different than the people that you meet in Kherson or you meet in Chernihiv. And so it's a country that is quite divided even from a behavioral standpoint. But here are some of the things that I want you to think about. One is that the story talks about the challenges of dealing with Moscow, the challenges with dealing with Western powers identified as Poland and Sweden, and with Turkish powers. The story is about internal conflict, looking for power and control. Corruption, it's not called corruption in a historical sense, is a big aspect of what this story is about. The access to wealth, the access to money in order to pay for troops, in order to pay for cultural institutions, in order to reinforce the power base. Remember that Ukraine and Poland, to a large extent, did not have hereditary power. They had an elected power, and so you had quite a lot of volatility in terms of rulers from across the various different areas that ultimately you could call the Polish-Lithuanian segment of the geography, the left bank, right bank, which is the way Ukraine is divided historically. And all of this makes for a very difficult story to tell, which is why I'm very disappointed that none of you have your pens and paper out, because that quiz is going to be particularly difficult at the end of this evening. So this idea of competing powers, this idea of internal control, this idea of money, all of this should resonate with you in terms of what you're reading in the press and how Zelensky is holding on to power, the negotiations with the West versus Russia, Ukraine's place on the map. And so in a way, when you think about Grange Park Opera's decision to show Mazeppa in 2025, it's a brilliant move because in effect it brings some sense of context to what we're dealing with today in a more historical framework, and Mazeppa is no better an example of the challenges that we face than I can think of in terms of another allegory for the war today. So that's something that I wanted to ask you to think about as I tell the story, and then you'll be able to pick out certain elements that I think are going to be quite interesting. The second thing about me, and then I'm going to stop on me, has been that I tackled during COVID the translation of my great-great-grandfather's memoirs. And it was a fascinating journey, both from a standpoint of having a dialogue with someone from the past, but having that dialogue within the context of a family. Mazeppa plays a small role in his memoirs, which I will refer to. But I think, for me, it was also a very interesting journey in terms of how a family identifies with a particular region. The Kotschoubey's have been basically in Ukraine for 400 years, playing various different roles. And I believe around the turn of the century, we were among the largest landholders in Ukraine based on the number of hectares. And that responsibility was something that effectively informed the final sort of rush for identity in the early 20th century, which was marked by a failed attempt to create a hetmanate again on the heels of what was in place up until 1762, and Kirill Razumovsky was the last official hetman of Ukraine until Catherine the Great abolished the hetmanate. But what was interesting was that we were really seeing an emergence of that state identity. And so I want to leave one final point about my adventures in terms of history, in terms of trying to create a television series with this other overriding thought, which is very important. Today, Mazeppa in Ukraine is identified as a nation builder, as a Ukraine hero, folk hero. He is representative of that incredible desire for independence and for identity. In effect, one of the reasons I wanted to talk tonight, and one of the reasons that this is a real privilege, is because within the context of a revolution, narratives in history tend to be hijacked for political purposes because those carriers of that history are no longer around, no longer play a voice in the narrative of a nation. And Ukraine is no exception, and neither is Russia. They've hijacked a story to suit their purposes, to justify a war, to justify independence. And Mazeppa is that really sort of rallying figure in that attempt to create nation. In fact, pay attention, because Mazeppa never wanted to create an independent state. The Cossacks did not exist for the purpose of being an independent state. The first emergence of the Cossack state were as hired mercenaries to protect the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom from incursions from the Tatars, who were a fairly important figure or factor in the story I'm about to tell, but they were effectively vassals of the Turkish state, and they were raiding up into Ukraine all the way into the Polish-Lithuanian state. And so the Cossacks were really that buffer, but they always served a master. They were quite adept at finding the best master to serve, but they served a master nonetheless. And this notion that we rewrite history in order to say, but Ukraine was always in this state of building an independent country, is actually manipulating history for the purposes of trying to create a legitimate legacy, which doesn't really jive with the realities of history. So I want that to be another thing that I'm going to ask you to think about. And so with that, and I'm just going to refer to some notes as we go along, I want to talk a little bit about now the history of the opera and Mazeppa's influence. And I'm going to start with a question. Does anybody have in their minds a way that they imagine Mazeppa when it comes to a figurative representation? Does anybody have an image in their head?
Short and wiry.
I'm sorry?
Short and wiry and fierce.
So does anybody have the idea of somebody tied to a horse? You have that, right? Yeah, it's a problem. You shouldn't be thinking about men being tied to horses in general, but you're right. And in effect, that has been the representation of Mazeppa in 19th century romantic artistic efforts. A lot of it comes from two effectively clear sources. One is Voltaire, who wrote about Mazeppa and wrote about him being tied to a horse. The second is Lord Byron, who published a poem in 1819 called Mazeppa, where he figures heavily in this notion of man tied to a horse. And a lot of this concept goes back to the horse being representative of freedom. It's representative of the steppe. The horse has this incredible ability to conjure up a sense of independence in a 19th century type of context. But Mazeppa was never tied to a horse. So Géricault and Delacroix, who both painted paintings of him tied to a horse, certainly borrowed heavily from folklore. Yes?
Was he caught in someone's bed?
So thank you, because sex is going to figure very heavily in this talk, which is why you're all very happy to be here. And in fact, one of the things that we know about Ivan Mazeppa was that he had two qualities. One, he was clearly very popular with the women. The second thing is that he had this almost sorcerer's ability to carry people's attention, to have people follow him. And I think it's safe to say leaders tend to have that charisma, and he certainly had that. And on one of his missions early in his youth, and we don't really know when he was born, the idea is that he's probably born around 1639, but there is no clear record as to his birth date. But around the time he was 20 years old, he had already been made a chamberlain, Kammerjunker of Jan Kazimierz, the king of Poland, who sent him on various different missions, primarily into Ukraine. And he was traveling with one of his other chambermen, and it transpired that Mazeppa took a slight break from their mission and seduced the wife of a noted landowner in the region. The landowner, of course, learning of his wife's indiscretions with Mazeppa, decides to punish Mazeppa, strip him naked, tie him to a horse, and have the horse run through brush and nettles in order to punish this miscreant. I don't think that the story about him being in somebody's bed is wrong, but we do know that the story about him being tied to a horse is not quite right. However, and this is the part of storytelling which is really interesting, a lot of elements that we see and that we're going to hear about are actually taken from folklore. And within the 16th, 17th century language of love, the notion of being tied to a horse was something that was quite common. So for us today, or for a 19th century artist, this was a particularly fun subject to paint. If you were sitting around the campfire in 16th century Poland, telling a story about a man tied to a horse was probably a pretty standard type of imagery that was shared among the various different members of that part of the world. So it's no surprise that, of course, we borrow from that imagery quite heavily.
You have to say he was naked when he was tied to the horse.
I mean, this is kind of an elegant setting. I don't know if we really want to talk about that. But yes, I think he was naked to get the full impact of those nettles on all parts of his anatomy. And so I want to share that with you, because a lot of what we're going to be seeing today and discussing is really about borrowing from already existing folklore, existing stories. And so a lot of what we're going to be seeing is really just a coming together of the sort of oral narratives that existed in the region. So Mazeppa, within the context of the traditions, became, because of the story I'm going to share with you tonight, effectively a great figure for all number of different reasons, and informed art, informed poetry, and informed, obviously, music. So Franz Liszt wrote a very complex piece called Mazeppa. Actually, I think it had another name, but it was the second title was Mazeppa, and it's a particularly brutal piece to play on the piano. And one of the performances, one of the pianists just couldn't carry. I mean, a very professional pianist, and at a certain point, he stops as he's playing the piece, and he looks at the audience and he says, "This is so difficult that I feel like I'm being tied to a horse as I play this piece." And in a way, that's a lovely way to transmit the sort of importance of this figure in 19th century art. Obviously, I mentioned Delacroix and Géricault, who both painted paintings of Mazeppa, but I do want to talk also about the operas. There was a first initial opera that was written by Fittinghoff-Schell. It was a opera called Mazeppa that didn't get that much in the way of fame. It was produced and performed in 1859. My family was there, and in fact, the Interior Ministry, the secret police, went to my family to ask them to get permission to perform the opera, given that there was quite a lot of elements to it that may have been problematic to a viewing public. But you know, that was the first reiteration of Mazeppa in the musical world. And then, of course, Tchaikovsky became completely inspired by it and effectively almost fanatic about Poltava and about Mazeppa. And he performed, or rather wrote, the opera, which was performed in 1884, both in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Interestingly enough, the Moscow audiences liked it. The St. Petersburg audiences were quite brutal and effectively panned the opera. And it's a very difficult opera to listen to, so make sure that you're prepared this summer. I will share with you the words of Valery Gergiev, who is the conductor of the Mariinsky Opera Theater and Ballet, who shared with me that the Kotchoubey aria, obviously written by Tchaikovsky, is one of his favorite arias. So there are moments of brilliance in this opera, but it is a 3-hour opera, and I don't know if Grange Park Opera will do the whole thing, but it will test your endurance, as does this story. But I wanted to then sort of hark back to the source of this opera, and it comes from Alexander Pushkin. Many of you know who he is, one of Russia's greatest poets. And his relationship to our family was twofold. One is he was madly in love with Natalia Viktorovna Kotchoubey, who was the daughter of Viktor Pavlovich Kotchoubey, who was on the secret committee and the Minister of the Interior and a very powerful figure in Russia. And I think in many ways this was an ode, or many poems, to his infatuation, his affection towards Natalia, but also to her family. And so I want to take a pause and give you some historical context about why this is so interesting, because one of the accusations levied at Pushkin is that he created a poem that was largely a sort of cheering for Russian imperialism and for the greatness of Peter, and in general, it was a love story to Russia, perhaps to impress the emperor, who had his eyes on Pushkin as an agitator, and in fact, Pushkin had been sent into internal exile a number of different times, partly because he was obviously in love with Natalia Viktorovna, but partly because there was something very interesting happening in Russia, and that is that in effect, by the turn of the 19th century, the Ukrainians control Russia. And they control it because the first chancellor under Catherine the Great, Alexander Bezborodko, comes from Ukraine, becomes one of the most powerful chancellors as we head into the beginning of the 19th century. And he plays a very important role in effectively spearheading the career of his nephew, Viktor Pavlovich, who not only becomes very close to Paul I, the emperor, who eventually gets killed, but also to his son Alexander and the other son Nicholas. In the course of that relationship, Kotchoubey, who effectively helps to promote Russia's importance not only within the scope of Europe, but certainly in the post-Napoleonic era, effectively has most of his wealth rooted in Ukraine. And it begins a process where Ukrainians play a very important role in the running and in the effectively administration of the Russian Empire. Interestingly enough, those people today who are trying to rewrite history are arguing that these are all traitors to the Ukrainian cause because they effectively willingly went to the emperor and served him, in effect undermining Ukraine's chance at independence. So it's a kind of a funny situation if you look at it from a modern lens, but at the time, the Ukrainians became extremely important. So isn't it good that Pushkin writes a poem to talk about the incredible loyalty of certain Ukrainians to the crown and to the emperor? And isn't it great that we know that Ukrainians are very faithful to the Romanovs? And that becomes one of the rallying points around the story that Pushkin writes. Of course, he does do two things, and we're going to talk a little bit about that to sort of close off some of our discussions. But he does two things. In effect, he turns the story into a love story, when in fact it's really a story about political power and intrigue, and it's about Ukraine's place, or the Cossack nation's place, amongst the various different warring empires. He obviously adds quite a lot of characters who don't exist historically, but I think when you think about what he was trying to do, is he was trying to do what Lord Byron did, was really romanticize what was a very difficult political situation. So from a standpoint of where we are today, we have a poem that's extremely pro-Russian. We have a poem that effectively is a beautiful love story, and the Mazeppa story effectively encapsulated by the opera, encapsulated, by the way, by 6 different films that have been done in the 20th century, including 2 silent films, really gives us this sense of a love story. And like I started the discussion tonight, a love story between a 65-year-old man and a 16-year-old girl. But in effect, that's not what the story is about. And so the final part of our discussion is really to talk about what the story is really about. It helps at least to frame for you the opera when you see it. It helps to frame, some of the stories that I shared with you as we began this journey. And I hope that it'll also give you a sense of understanding the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but from a historical lens looking back. The real story, as I began the talk, is a story about power. It's a story about shifting alliances. It's about men, and in this case men indeed, looking to secure their place in various different, I would argue, interesting locations within the Polish-Lithuanian sphere of influence. And so, in effect, in order to secure power, in order to secure favor, you were constantly looking to leverage your position either against the Polish king or for the Grand Prince of Moscow. And this game was being played with obviously quite a lot of gifts being provided. There was obviously military contracts for the various different wars that we're taking on. And we have the great fortune of having my dear friends, the Galitsins, here tonight. And one of the great villains in this story is Vasily Golitsyn. And in general, with the Galitsins, you've got to be very careful, right? So this is another cautionary tale. But Vasily Golitsyn, who effectively represents one of the most powerful families in the realm, positions himself with the regent, Sophia Alexeyevna, as the 2 young future czars, Peter and Ivan, who together are going to rule, are learning the ropes. And the regent, the older sister, is a particularly nasty one, and there's some great paintings of her, one by Repin, which I suggest you look at the end of this evening, which sort of shows her in all her evil abilities. And Vasily not only becomes her lover, but effectively, de facto, through her, becomes the ruler of Russia. And there is this sort of problem called Ukraine, and there's another problem called Poland. And it's a constant battle to try to figure out how to manage these 2 conflicting and rather problematic areas from a geopolitical standpoint as well as from a peace standpoint. And remember, Russia is embarking also on its first sort of expansionary view of its role in the region. Up until that point, we had grand princes. We didn't really have this idea of a consolidated power. That arrives really in the 17th century, really after the times of trouble. And so in effect, these various different points, Russia as an imperial power, Ukraine, Poland, become all very important elements in the geopolitical race. And Vasily understands this very quickly, and he understands that in order to control the region, he needs to make sure that he curries favor with the right captain the right team, and of course it's anybody's guess who is going to be winning. As we mentioned, this is a kind of rotation of different chairs. So Ivan Samoilovich comes to power. He is a competent administrator, but extremely corrupt, builds up for himself and his family an incredible fortune, and becomes really one of the great fortunes of the region. And in effect, there is some question about his loyalty. So Mazeppa, along with Kotchoubey, write a denunciation to Moscow saying, you know, this guy Ivan Samoilovich that you've got working on your behalf, he's not the right guy. And this letter of denunciation, which actually Kotchoubey wrote, it sticks to a very, very clear, and it's available, it's in the archives, list of egregious behavior and violations. And in effect, Vasily gives the benediction to overthrow Samoilovich. So he overthrows Samoilovich, and in effect, just as this is happening, Peter the Great is coming into his own with the Streltsy insurrection, and in effect realizes that one of his big problems and the block that he has in coming to power is this powerful Vasily Golitsyn. So now we have this sort of triangle of power. We have Ivan Samoilovich about losing power. We have Vasily Golitsyn, who is clearly on the out, and Peter the Great, who is rising to his new, I guess, role as the future Tsar of Russia. And in the process, Mazeppa very skillfully manages not only the fact that Golitsyn is overthrown, sent into Siberia, but he manages to use the fact that he paid Golitsyn 10,000 gold coins to become hetman as an indication of his corruption, of his inability to manage. And Peter the Great basically is delighted with the results. And within this context, we have the Azov campaigns. As the Russians begin to expand, they're trying to take more territory from the Turks. And these are disastrous campaigns. But Vasily, in his sort of delusion in his power, is able to convince Moscow that, in fact, these defeats that are taking place against the Turkish powers are not defeats, but they're great victories. And all of this starts working against Golitsyn, and in theory, it should be working against Mazeppa, but he skillfully navigates it, and indeed becomes not only the hetman of Ukraine, but is able to access all of Samoilovich's wealth. He beheads the son of Samoilovich, and Samoilovich is sent into exile into Siberia. And so there's a really nice element of wealth transfer from Samoilovich's behavior into Mazeppa's coffers. And so you begin to see that this transfer of wealth then helps to ensure quite a number of elements, especially when it comes to political stability. As Andrei alluded to, the relationship with Peter the Great is working just fine. In fact, he is the second recipient of the Order of St. Andrews, which is the highest order that you can receive in Russia. There have only been 1,000 of them that have ever been given, and one of them went, in fact, the second one went to Mazeppa. So I don't think there's any question about Mazeppa's place within Peter's world. However, I would argue that Peter was really making sure that he had that region under control, so there was an exchange of favors and an exchange of reciprocal, I would say, elements of gratitude that were really politically motivated. I don't think Mazeppa did anything particularly important to warrant that award other than make sure that Ukraine remained in Peter's sphere of influence. And so within the backdrop of all of this, Vasily Kotchoubey is, in fact, Ivan's best friend. And Mazeppa and Kotchoubey are overthrowing hetmans together, they're stealing money together, and they're reinforcing their wealth and power. In fact, today, if you travel through Ukraine, a lot of the monasteries and a lot of the churches were, in fact, endowed by Mazeppa, and in the case of our family, a good portion of the properties that my family had up until the revolution were given by Mazeppa to the Kotchoubeys. And we know this because there have been declarations, universals, as I'm sure President Trump is doing as we speak, that allows us to document these gifts and these awards. And this relationship is such that, in effect, Kotchoubey asks for or negotiates with Mazeppa to have one of his daughters married to Mazeppa's nephew. And so Anna becomes the wife of Abidovsky, and that's one of the first sort of, I would say, political alliances formed between the Kochoubeys and Mazeppa. The second one is that Mazeppa becomes the godfather of Maria or Matryona. And interestingly enough, I found in the archives at Harvard University a request for prayer to St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, which was written by Vasily Kotchoubey in 1684. Which asks the monks at the St. Catherine's in Sinai to pray for members of the family, and Maria's not there, so we know she was definitely born after that fact. But these are some of the things that we use in order to understand when people are born, because birth dates are quite problematic in that part of the world. And so Mazeppa, in effect, is definitely tied to the Kotchoubey family, not only as the uncle-in-law of Anna, but as the godfather of Matryona, and there may have been other links that we don't know about. But in 1702, his wife dies. She's a wealthy widow in her own right who left him quite a lot of money. They never have any children together. And by 1702, the coffers are beginning to run dry. It's a very expensive job to keep Ukraine alight, as no doubt the EU knows, and so does the US, and no different in 1702. So he's feeling a pinch. He's realizing that he's got to come up with money somewhere. And I don't exclude the fact that the next few years is all about scheming, which wife do I take in order to secure additional money for my coffers. And that's something that may have been the motivation between his interest in his goddaughter, but in effect, in 1704, there is the beginning of a love affair. And we know all of this because there are letters that exist that you can read. They were used as part of Kotchoubey's denunciation of Mazeppa, but they are quite vivid, which for you might be really interesting, I mean, in terms of the affection that they have for each other. And so this prompts all sorts of speculation about the nature of that relationship. We have no proof that that was a relationship that was ever consummated, and I think given the mores of the day, it probably was not. But it becomes a huge problem because it is a critical violation of Orthodox canon for a godparent to have any kind of affection for their godchildren, because in the eyes of God, that is a relationship between a parent and a child. So there is no difference between a godparent and a goddaughter, or a godmother and a godson, and a father and a daughter, and so on and so forth. So this is a canon that is unbreakable. And so this poses a big problem for Mazeppa. The Kochoubeys obviously have nothing to do, they want nothing to do with this, and they break apart the marriage. In the meantime, and I'm going to be finishing off very quickly, but I want to just finish the last few years. Charles XII is waging a campaign which is known as the Northern War. And talk about Mazeppa's coffers, there's a real big issue with whether Charles XII will, in fact, defeat Peter. And there's no reason to doubt that that's possible, because he effectively is able to rule over Poland, he rules over Denmark, he rules over Saxony. So Charles XII becomes this sort of wonderkind in the Northern Wars. And it's anybody's guess if Peter is going to be able to rout the armies. In fact, interestingly, by the time we get to Poltava in 1709, the Swedish forces are so spent, I don't even think they have proper clothing. They've been on campaign for 15 years, and in effect, they're a ragtag army. But that's never shown in movies or in paintings, but in fact, that's probably what the army looked like at the time. And so Mazeppa has found himself in between these two areas, and he's thinking, you know, I've asked Peter to be my protector, and I'm thinking this Russian thing is good. But if Peter loses to Charles XII, I've got a problem here, because, you know, a lot of my wealth and power is depending on a powerful patron. And so Mazeppa is trying to figure out how this is all going to play out. And in effect, I think you can understand him, right? You don't really know how these things are going to play out. And so he does go, in fact, towards the Poles with a view towards allying with not only Poland, but with Sweden. And Kotchoubey obviously knows this, right? So now there's a fundamental issue, which is who's going to win the Northern War? Who do I ally myself with? And how do I ensure that I'm on the receiving end of whatever spoils are going to be divided up? And so the historical aspect of it, which has turned into a romantic aspect of it, is that Kotchoubey actually realizes that the Poles and the Swedes aren't going to make it. And so he realizes that this is just a bad plan on the part of Mazeppa. Mazeppa's losing money. He's desperate for a new role. He's desperate for more money. And so Kotchoubey denounces his friend Mazeppa in 1707. And effectively, Peter the Great's like, wait a second. I've spent all this money, Order of St. Andrew. Mazeppa's my guy. So I'm not going to turn against this person that I've been supporting for the past 15 years just because Kotchoubey has some information about the fact that Mazeppa is negotiating with the Poles. The romantic side of it is that the rejection of the wedding or the marriage proposal that Mazeppa was supposedly giving to Kotchoubey's daughter was the reason for his betrayal. But in fact, it's very clear that this is a politically motivated decision. In the opera, it's a romantic motivated decision. If we fast forward in terms of the events, effectively in 1707, Matryona is probably married off. By 1708, Kotchoubey is handed over to the Russians as a traitor. He's tortured and his head is chopped off. And there's a funny part in an opera that was performed in St. Petersburg and Leningrad at the time where the props were misplaced. And at one of the scenes, after Kotchoubey is executed, Orlik comes onto the scene to show Mazeppa's head. And obviously, having a head on stage is maybe not the most elegant way to gather up an appetite, so they have him in a bag. And in effect, they had misplaced the prop, and so there was no head, just a bag. And at one point, the quick-thinking actor playing Orlik raises the bag, realizes it's empty, and then tries to do sort of a magic trick to make it reappear, and it doesn't. And then the whole audience bursts out into laughter. But it is one of the gruesome scenes in the opera. And in effect, 1707, 1708, so Kotchoubey loses his head. Mazeppa, 3 months after Kotchoubey loses his head, announces his alliance with Charles XII. A hasty execution that ultimately didn't really help the Kotchoubey family, but certainly at least vindicated the fact that we knew that Mazeppa was up to no good. And effectively then, quick retribution, Charles XII Peter forces Charles XII and Mazeppa into Moldavia and Wallachia, where they die, well, in the case of Mazeppa, he dies in 1709 and is buried in a grave that's since disappeared, and so we don't even know where he's buried. But in effect, a man who dies without any legacy, he dies effectively without any money, and he dies without any children or any heirs. The Kotchoubey family was rehabilitated, which was a fortuitous moment in terms of our economic capacity. So we lost a head, but we did get quite a lot in return. And there's a lot of other elements, but I'm going to ask you to look at your Wikipedias and your Googles and your articles on it for the rest of it. And as I promised, I would stop before dinner was served, and so that you can talk to your neighbors. But if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. I've actually prepared 40 pages of notes, and I did not use all of them. But I'm so desperate to share with you all these little pieces of information that I couldn't. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Would you describe him as a political pragmatist?
For sure, and it's a great question because, in effect, he had to play and did, in fact, play between a lot of power interests. At one point, he was sent to deal with the Ottoman Turks, where he had to effectively convince them that he was anti-Orthodox and that he was really a very pro-Muslim, pro-Ottoman in his thinking. And by the way, if you look at costume history and you look at traditions, Poland and Ottoman empires did a lot of trading, and a lot of the fabrics of the costumes really come from that region of the world. So there was a lot of trade between the two areas. So that's point one. Point two, an interesting little side note. You know the famous Repin painting of the Cossacks writing a letter to the Sultan. So the Ataman who was responsible for actually writing the letter was Ivan Sirko. And Sirko captured Mazeppa on his way to the Ottoman Empire on one of his various different missions, and he was coming with 15 Slavic prisoners, and I imagine that they were either for the harem or they were being gelded for their role as janissaries. So in traditional, just so that we can add more flavor to our rather scandalous discussions. So in the Ottoman court, the Slavic women were used in the harem, and there are quite a number of very famous mothers of sultans who are probably Ruthenian or Ukrainian, and the men were castrated and would fight in the army. And that was a very important economic exchange between the North and the Ottoman Empire, and so he was on his way with 15 gifts and was stopped by Sirko, who was effectively an agent of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, Peter the Great's father, and he actually was the one who sent, rather than cut off the head of Mazeppa, who should have had his head decapitated for that breach of loyalty, if you want to call it that, Sirko sent him to Moscow, and that's where he began his relationship. So talking about pragmatism, there's a really good example where he should have lost his head, but somehow talked his way into going to Moscow, and that's when he began his effective relationship with the Russians.
I learned a huge amount from you. So I didn't know that we say it Mazeppa. Is that how we say Mazeppa? Mazeppa?
Yes.
Mazeppa or Mazeppa? How do you say it?
You would put the emphasis on the first syllable as
Do
opposed.
I have a double P or a single P?
Now it's accepted to do single P.
Can you tell everyone again, so Mazeppa was 60 or so, and the woman who loved him was aged
16, yeah.
Oh, so when she says, look, I'm going to leave my family and come with you, Mazeppa, in real life, what does he say?
So, good question, and we have quite a lot of, and in my 40 pages of notes, and I'm not going to go get them now. I actually have quotes about him talking about the pleasure he derived from kissing her white skin, and how incredibly, touched he was by her gentleness and her kindness. So he certainly, and there certainly are historical letters between the two, which may be a romanticized version of a meeting that never took place, or a real reflection of the two. But she also was, and so I didn't spend a lot of time talking about her, but she apparently wanted to defy her parents, and was very happy to get into his sphere for any number of reasons.
Which
And
is what happens in the opera, but in real life...
But in real life, there is evidence that she actually fled to his house, and there are love letters between the two of them. And so he sent her back.
That's what I know about it.
That's right.
She actually had to go back to her family.
That's right.
So the opera's not right.
No, the opera has a lot of errors, including, of course, the whole timeline. But look, I think the other interesting thing, and I did have that prepared as well to talk about. It's always important to understand what happened afterwards. In our family records, the daughter that marries Simeon Chukevich is Elizabeta. But in other records, it's Matryona. And apparently she is then wed to the son of the Judge General and of another neighboring Cossack settlement. And in effect, in 1707, she's married off to this young colonel in the Cossack army. Like I said, in our family records, that's not the case, but that is one of the official versions. Then her father-in-law is a Mazeppa supporter. He gets exiled in 1710 to Siberia. The family is effectively stripped of a lot of its importance. And apparently she then goes to a nunnery and becomes the abbess of the monastery in Nizhin. And there is a mother, Melania. So just what happens in the Orthodox faith is that you usually take a monastic name that starts with the letter of your own name. So you'll never be, in my case, a Father Alexander, but you will become Father Adrian. So you keep the first letter, but you change your name. So there's a Mother Melania who dies in 1736, and there's a pretty good sense that she was probably Matryonos. So she took the veil. Her father-in-law, if indeed she did get married to Simeon Shukevich, became a monk in Siberia. And, again, let's be very clear, in a landscape bereft of any kind of service or any kind of facility or protection, living in a monastery is a pretty nice thing, right? So when you hear people going to a monastery, it's also because it's one of the few functioning institutions in that part of the world.
Can I just come back to Dimitri, to your question, was Mazeppa Orthodox? His mother was
An abbess.
an abbess of a monastery in
Kiev. Yep.
And she lived to like age 90, and she was quite close to him and quite influential as well. So very Orthodox from that perspective.
This is another clarity point. So your ancestor, Kotchoubey, who's in the opera, that's the only reason I know him. So can you be very clear? So he was killed.
He was killed. He was beheaded in Bela Tserkva in July of 1708, along with his brother-in-law Iskra, Colonel Iskra. They're buried in the Lavra cemetery. Actually, not even in a cemetery. They're buried right next to Prime Minister Stolypin in the Lavra, which is the main monastery church in Kiev.
Have you been there?
I have many times. Yep. And so you can still visit. I don't know if the head was replaced on the body. But in any event, the full body is supposed to have been buried at that place.
You mentioned that the last hetman was Razumovsky.
Yes.
I thought you might like to musically expand on that.
Well, of course, his son, as you know, was Andrei Razumovsky, who was a patron of Beethoven, and so a number of quartets were composed under the patronage of Andrei Razumovsky in Vienna. And it is, in fact, the same last hetman that we're talking about.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that patronage does stem from that part of the world. And I am not going to be here talking about what's better or what's worse, but you have to understand that in 16th, 17th century period, and actually going into the 18th century, Poland and certainly Ukraine were a much more civilized part of the world than Moscow was, right? Moscow was still a backwater. It was still a very oriental place. Women would be completely veiled. Men would have beards. They would wear very tall fur hats with very heavy coats. And there was, this was what Peter the Great came to change, right? But at that point, Russia was still extremely backwards, if you want to call it that. And this Polish-Lithuanian corridor would have been, in an enlightened Baroque atmosphere, a much more interesting place to live. So the traditions would have informed a lot of the legacies that these great, very wealthy patrons of the arts who emerged around that time would do in terms of continuing those legacies. And Andrei Razumovsky in Vienna is one of those examples.
You have to say one other thing, Alexei, before you, which is, you said that the opera was very long and difficult. I work in showbiz. You never say one of your shows is long and difficult. So I'd like you to tell everyone what a great opera it is. Forget the long and difficult. It's not long and difficult.
It's not long and difficult, and I understand that after our discussion, there will be nude people on horses being whipped and a few beheadings. So, in effect, what's not to love?
Speaking on the beheadings, was that Mazeppa who beheaded Kotchoubey or Peter the Great?
Peter the Great.
So actually, officially, it was Philip Orlik. And have you guys ever traveled to Orly Airport in France? So Orly is named after Philip Orlik's son, who was a general in the Swedish army and then moved into the French army. But Philip Orlik was the executioner and the torturer in King. In effect, it was a very messy process because it was obviously an extremely sensitive issue. And it was the torturing was based on a number of very concrete denunciations that were submitted to Peter the Great through the Governor General of Kiev, who was Andrei Golitsyn, another Golitsyn. you have to understand the Galicians ruled Russia, but we pretend that other people did. And so it was rejected, and then in due course they sent 2 of the ministers under Peter the Great to torture. But yeah, it was, and by the way, that was the reason I talked about the Samoilovich denunciation, because in effect that's the way the power grabs took place, right? You would go and say, oh, you should see what this guy is doing, and then you would submit your denunciations, and based on that they would dismiss or appoint a new hetman.
So one more question. Do you think when Kotchoubey was killed, did Mazeppa already envision that he would be going over to the Swedes, or not?
Yeah, so here's an interesting moment that kind of really reinforces the fact that Mazeppa had already made his decision in 1707, when one of the Kotchoubey girls, whether it's Matryona or Elizaveta, is given over to Chukiewicz's, to the Chukiewicz family. The right thing to do, because of the role of the godfather, is to ask the godfather's opinion. And that's why there's a school of thought that says it was Matryona, because they asked Mazeppa what he thought of that betrothal of Matryona with Simeon Chukiewicz. And he said, I don't know why you're rushing into this. There'll be plenty of Polish nobles to choose from one day. And that was in 1707. He betrays Peter the Great at the end of in November 1708. So that statement, which has come down to us today, is indicative of the fact that he was pretty convinced that they would become part of the Polish-Lithuanian ducal estates, and therefore that sort of response is the best evidence that we have that Kotchoubey understood that something was going to happen. Anyway, I don't know if it were earlier indications, but that was certainly one of them that suggests that he was already very much in the planning stage.
So just a very, very quick question. You mentioned, fascinating from the point of view of the story, the Kotchoubey archives. Can you tell me, where are they? Who has access to them? Have you read them personally?
So I'm going to answer your question in an annoying way in 2 ways. So in preparing for this speech, I asked ChatGPT. I asked ChatGPT and then Google, but I asked ChatGPT to write the speech for me. And it came up with a really interesting set of points and information. And I'm like, God, I really don't know anything about my family, because ChatGPT has come up with all this information that I've never heard about. And so as it turned out, it was a complete exercise in hallucinations. Basically, it made up a story that had absolutely no relevance, and I was reassured that actually all my work hadn't been for naught. But to answer your question, the archives, some of which are available online for the Kotchoubey family, were located in Yaroslavl, which is an estate in Sumy today, in Sumy province, interestingly enough, today being constantly bombarded by the Russians. And that archive was evacuated in 1941 to Moscow. Remember that the Germans overtook Ukraine, so in effect it was under German occupation for 2 years. And the Russians, ahead of the arrival of the Germans, evacuated all important documents and artifacts to avoid them falling into Nazi hands. So that sort of has saved those archives. They're available. They're in Moscow. I have seen them. And they're fascinating, of course. But the other sad part about it is that whole archive was copied. It was kept in Dzikanko, which is the big Kotchoubey estate in Poltava. And so they saved it from the German bombardment, only to have placed the archive in a place that was then bombarded by the Red Army when they retook Poltava. So in effect, the indignity that Ukraine has suffered during the war is that if it wasn't destroyed by the Germans, it was then destroyed by the Red Army, which basically laid waste to Ukraine. So in a way, when you think about what the Russians are doing today, they're just reenacting an act of desecration that they conducted 80 years ago. But in effect, those archives were lost, but thanks to the evacuation in 1941, the principal archives remained. And that's, by the way, why we know a lot of this information, because we have the last will and testaments, we have the letters, we have a very rich archive of information that remains today. I can give you the address as well if you'd like. Great. Well, I'm so happy that you've restrained yourself from asking other questions about 16-year-olds and beheadings, because it would have really collapsed into something unruly. Thank you so much for your attention, and really, if you have any other questions, please let me know, but I expect to see you all in June, correcting all the faults that Tchaikovsky and his libretto writer conducted, and you'll hopefully enjoy the opera more, knowing some of the story behind it. Thank you.